Manic Bestia. Hiya, Manic Bestia here. Tonight I want to talk about something which I don't think has really been talked about properly, at least not in the ways that I felt. And it's to do with a lot of the media that I consumed from the past, a time where I wasn't even born. So, allow me to explain. So I grew up with a lot of late 90s and early 2000s technology and media because of my brother and my parents introducing them to me as a kid. So I played with a lot of toys that my brother used to have, I read a lot of his books, and my family always owned a Dreamcast, which is probably the most Y2K console out there, let's be honest. Looking back at so much of the entertainment industry of the 90s has really put into perspective just how much of an innovative and exciting time it was for kids, especially with video games, which is the main focus of this video because I'm a radical gamer who plays fucking Kirby 64, hell yeah! One of the things that I wish more people would talk about when analysing and discussing this type of media are the over-encompassing visuals and aesthetics that were created that define this era specifically. Whether it was the choice of music, whether it was choice of textures, camera, even the camera lens, I started to notice a lot of trends that were going on at the time, and how all of these things kind of come together and create an overall feeling which a lot of indie developers are actually trying to harness today. To start with, I just want to talk about video game lighting and textures because I can easily show some visual examples for that. Apologies to any blind viewers though, I guess you'll just have to imagine it. Some of the most defining games of the late 90s were, of course, 3D platformers and shooters. Leading developers like Nintendo, Square Enix, Rareware, id Software and Valve were all competing for a slice of the three-dimensional pie, investing heavily in state-of-the-art technology to push optimization and graphics to make each of their games stand out and look beautiful. But you already knew this. Using techniques like baked lighting and hand-drawn textures, the artists and developers in these teams were able to craft immersive and striking worlds on top of all the level design elements, which is extremely inspiring and impressive to me as someone who personally fell in love with this visual style. So what are some of the elements that create this feeling I get from these seemingly completely disparate pieces of media? Beyond the surface level point of, they were around at the same time, so they must have been influenced by the same trends. Well, the first thing I noticed when looking through and discovering so many of these 3D games from this era is the use of baked shadows and lighting. Of course, the hardware of consoles like the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation were limited in their processing power, with the Sony PlayStation being limited to only one real-time light source on screen at any given time. The very limited 3D processors on the home computers in the late 90s also provided developers with a lot of technical challenges when it came to conveying their crazy and ambitious worlds to players. Let's take a look at two seemingly completely different types of video games and see how the use of textures and lighting connects them, because that's what my dumb brain does without me noticing anyway. Let's first take a look at the graphical style of the goofy and cartoony LEGO Racers, which had a multi-platform release in 1999 to various consoles. And let's compare the visual makeup of that game to one with a much darker and seemingly opposing art direction, such as American McGee's Alice, released in 2000 for Windows computers. In LEGO Racers, you race, of course, and if you want to race, you're going to need a racetrack, and the folks over at High Voltage and Climax Studios really went all out with the LEGO theming for these courses. You've got everything from the High Castle to the Ancient Pharaoh's Tomb, and even a space race. So obviously LEGO Racers is extremely goofy, wacky, crazy, maybe even zany, okay? Maybe even zany. But when it comes to the art direction of the courses themselves, there's actually genuinely a lot of immersive and somewhat dark environments. Let me explain. The use of baked lighting, and specifically baked shadows, is very reminiscent of this era. What with the limited processing power and graphical budget the artists had to work with, it was very common for them to use simplistic, high-contrast textures, especially for a cartoony kids game like Banjo-Kazooie, or in this case, LEGO Racers. The specific colour palette of the hand-painted textures shows a distinct restraint in the artists working on these games when it came to cartoony graphics, as a lot of 3D platformers were also aimed at children and went for very light-hearted, colourful visuals. Although I do think that at the time there were a lot of video games that intentionally tried to look cartoony, they don't really age as well as other video games because their use of flat textures and flat lighting hasn't really aged well at all compared to video games which use, texture blending and high contrast textures and lighting. For example, if we take a look at a game like Jersey Devil, we can see the texture artist went with a more simplistic style of cartoony graphics, using full bright colours and flat shades. But if we look at a game like Crash Bandicoot, you'll be able to notice it uses much more detailed textures overall, utilising transitions and harsh shadows to enhance the visual fidelity, while maintaining that cartoony aesthetic with excellent use of colour, set design and shading. You can really tell when a development team had access to extremely talented artists on the texturing side and on the 3D modeling side. When the textures and environmental shapes are able to fit together seamlessly is when you truly get something incredible, especially when working with hardware limitations. If we take a look at the art direction for Rayman 2, for example, you can see a lot of care and attention went into the graphical style. Every texture is beautifully hand-painted with these dark and dreamy spirals and the cartoonishly warped line work. The textures have this lopsided and whimsical look to them with exaggerated features that come straight out of a fairy tale. When it comes to the geometry of the worlds in Rayman 2, we're able to see how the textures and shapes synergize perfectly to create an extremely immersive and atmospheric environment. From the shadowy robo-pirates with their twisted industrial pipes and vents, to the gorgeous, warping landscapes within the Glade of Dreams. The artists took great care to make sure each polygon in their budget was shaped to complement and support the textures, while allowing some image warping which only elevates that feeling that you're exploring this magical world, making it come to life around you. If we then take a look at Medieval on the PlayStation, we can see a lot of similar techniques used, most notably the use of high contrast hand-painted textures with the exaggerated and warped models making up the environment. The technique of warping the shapes with these large exaggerated curves is most likely inspired by cartoonists working on background art for television and kids comics of the time. Shows like Dexter's Lab and the comic book stylings of Bradfield Dumpleton come to mind. Using extreme and exaggerated focal lengths and camera lenses was also a huge trend of the late 90s and the early 2000s. On a side note, the texture warping caused by the PlayStation's content-aware scaling also adds to this crooked and misshapen visual style. Whether intentional or not, this can be used to great effect, especially for horror games like Silent Hill and Clock Tower. Let's talk about fog and depth maps. One of the most popular ways to convey depth is by using a depth map or fog shader. But what was so fascinating about video games from this era is that a lot of the visual character comes from the limitations of the hardware. For example, using a fog effect or depth map to limit the player's range of vision so the game didn't have to load the entire area at once, only what the player sees. Not only was this extremely effective for optimization, but adding a depth map like this almost always enhances the atmosphere of the environment, adding a stronger sense of mystery to a world. A lot of modern video games try to have massive scope by using huge open worlds, but that can often lead to a lot of large empty areas devoid of any atmosphere and life. Whereas with these old school 3D games, we get a real sense of discovery and atmosphere within these comparatively tiny environments. It's a bit like having a toy box to play with instead of a giant sandpit, if you want a stupid analogy for some reason. This whole era was also a transitional time when developers were striving for realism in video games, with more grungy textures being implemented and some artists even using photo scans of real objects as textures to create more immersive and gritty environments. Famously, even Mario 64 used a real photo of Shibam Yemen for Lord knows what reason as the background to Wet Dry World, which just looks utterly bizarre when you see it out of context. Finally, I want to talk about the trending post-processing effects that were used during the late 90s and early 2000s, which heavily influenced pop culture at the time. If you've ever been on a deep dive into 90s advertisements, you'll start to see a trend when it comes to the color grading. TV and print ads would use high contrast filters to almost create an effect which is both overexposed and underexposed at the same time. A close comparison would be the visual characteristics of lomography, which is an aesthetic technique created using cheap instant cameras which use imperfections like discoloration and light leaks as a desired and intended effect. A lot of lomography artists and people inspired by the effect can often end up with these very striking and dark neon images, which is very reminiscent of the color grading techniques used most predominantly during the late 90s. The more you look at advertisements from the Y2K era, the more you can instantly recognize what decade it was made just from the type of camera lenses and color grading that was being used. The use of a fisheye lens, for example, is instantly recognizable for creating that radical, too cool for school montage look in skateboard videos. And quickly going back to textures real quick, developers would often use limited color palettes as a way to reduce the file size of the images, allowing them to have more space for other assets on the game cartridge. You can see this effect most clearly with pre-rendered games on the SNES like the Donkey Kong Country series, Super Mario RPG and Killer Instinct. Textures used on the PlayStation were also posterized to save space, and a byproduct of this was it made the textures higher contrast, increasing the saturation of colors and simultaneously increasing the brightness of highlights and decreasing the brightness of shadows. This, of course, creates another link to lomography and the high contrast look that the 90s so heavily adopted into its creative media universe. Going into the early 2000s with the PlayStation 2 and GameCube console generations, the video game world was finally introduced to fully realized 3D controls and environments with games games like Metroid Prime, Psychonauts, Halo, Shadow of the Colossus, etc, etc. Along with the PC gaming revolution being spearheaded by Valve and their Orange Box collection. As you can tell, we were quickly transitioning from the more fantastical look of 90s fantasy into the more clear and clinical look of the 2000s and the future. Of course, the influence of the 90s would bleed heavily into the 2000s, as with all generations. And we're still seeing the effects of these visual trends to this day, with so many video game developers and artists paying homage to these games which defined one of the most creative and innovative generations the gaming landscape has ever experienced. Alright, I think I've said enough. This entire video was sort of a stream of consciousness anyway, as I tried to explain how my brain creates these loose connections between completely different pieces of media from an era which I never even existed in. And now that I say that out loud, I realise just how autistic and retarded this entire video was. Why do I even bother? Why am I here? Don't get me wrong though, I do love overanalyzing things, and this was something I wanted to talk about for years, so I'm hoping you enjoyed my ramblings too. I will be focusing on more content like this going forward, so if you enjoyed this video then maybe stick around and see what I do next. I'll hardly post though because YouTube is not my job, and I'm glad it isn't. Good night.